At 7:30 a.m. on May 8, 1942, Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vejtasa strapped into his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber on the flight deck of USS Yorktown, watching radar operators track incoming Japanese aircraft 70 miles to the northwest. 27 years old, 5 months of combat flying, 0 air-to-air kills. The Japanese had launched 69 aircraft from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. 18 of them were Mitsubishi A6M Zeros fighters, the most lethal carrier-based aircraft in the world. Vejtasa was about to fight them in a dive bomber. The SBD Dauntless was never designed for dogfighting. It weighed nearly 11,000 pounds fully loaded. Its maximum speed was 250 miles per hour. The Zero could reach 334. In a turning fight, the Japanese fighter could complete a full circle in under 6 seconds. The Dauntless needed twice that time. American pilots had a name for what Vejtasa was about to attempt. They called it suicide. But USS Yorktown had a problem. The carrier had launched its strike force against the Japanese fleet the day before. 53 dive bombers and 22 torpedo planes had attacked and sunk the light carrier Shoho. Vejtasa himself had put a 1,000-pound bomb through her flight deck. Now those aircraft needed to recover, refuel, and rearm. The Yorktown was vulnerable. Fighter protection was almost non-existent. The carrier had only 18 F-4F Wildcats. 9 were already airborne on combat air patrol. The remaining 9 were being held in reserve. There simply were not enough fighters to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. Captain Frederick Sherman of USS Lexington had devised a desperate solution. He ordered SBD dive bombers to fly anti-torpedo plane patrol. The theory was simple. The Dauntless carried 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns and 1 or 2 30-caliber guns in the rear cockpit. If Japanese torpedo planes tried to attack at low altitude, the SBDs could dive on them from above. The dive bombers would become makeshift interceptors. The theory had never been tested in combat. At 7:30 that morning, Yorktown launched 8 SBD Dauntlesses from Scouting Squadron 5. Vejtasa was leading a 4-plane section. Their orders were to orbit at low altitude, watch for torpedo planes, and shoot them down before they could release their weapons. No one mentioned what would happen if Zero fighters found them first. The mathematics of carrier aviation in 1942 were brutal. Japanese pilots had been training for years. Many had combat experience over China. Their aircraft were purpose-built for the Pacific, with extraordinary range and maneuverability. American carrier pilots were learning on the job, flying machines designed before anyone understood what carrier warfare would actually require. The kill ratio told the story. In the first 6 months of the war, Zero fighters had achieved a 12-to-1 advantage against Allied aircraft. For every Zero shot down, 12 American, British, Dutch, or Australian planes fell from the sky. Scouting Squadron 5th had already lost aircraft in the Coral Sea campaign. On May 4th, during strikes against Tulagi Harbor, Japanese float planes had engaged American dive bombers. On May 7th, anti-aircraft fire had claimed several SBDs during the attack on Shoho. The squadron was down to 17 operational aircraft from its original 18. Vejtasa understood the odds. His dive bomber was 60 miles per hour slower than a Zero. It could not climb as fast, it could not turn as tight, it could not dive as steeply. In every measurable category except one, the Japanese fighter was superior. The exception was firepower. The SBD's twin 50-caliber machine guns fired heavier rounds than the Zero's twin 7.7mm guns, and the Japanese fighter had a critical weakness that American intelligence was only beginning to understand. The Zero had no armor plating. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single well-placed burst could turn it into a fireball. But placing that burst required getting a Zero into your gun sights, and getting a Zero into your gun sights meant surviving long enough to aim. If you want to see how Vejtasa's slow dive bomber performed against the fastest fighters in the Pacific, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Vejtasa. At 10:55 a.m., Yorktown's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 68 nautical miles. Fighter direction officers vectored the 9 airborne Wildcats to intercept. But they positioned the fighters too low, expecting torpedo planes at wave top level. The Japanese were flying at 10,000 feet. The Wildcats missed them completely. That left 8 SBD Dauntlesses orbiting between the Japanese strike force and the American carriers. 8 slow, heavy, unmaneuverable dive bombers against 18 Zero fighters, 33 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo planes. Vejtasa saw them first. A swarm of aircraft descending through scattered clouds to the northwest. He counted at least 50 silhouettes, and 8 of them were breaking formation, turning directly toward his 4-plane section. 8 Zeros against 4 Dauntlesses. The Japanese pilots must have thought it would be easy. They were about to discover that Stanley Vejtasa had learned something about the SBD Dauntless that no training manual had ever taught. Something that would keep him alive for the next 15 minutes while pilots around him died. Something that would change his life forever and earn him a medal that most dive bomber pilots never received. The Zeros opened fire at 800 yards. Vejtasa pushed his stick forward and dove straight at them. The standard response to a Zero attack was to run. Dive for the deck. Use the Dauntless's weight to build speed in a descent. Try to reach the protective anti-aircraft fire of the fleet before the Japanese fighter caught you. Vejtasa did the opposite. He had learned something during training that his commanding officer had emphasized repeatedly. When a faster aircraft attacks from behind or above, the natural instinct is to turn away, to flee. But turning away gives the attacker a perfect deflection shot. The target moves predictably. The bullets find their mark. Turning into the attack changes everything. When a pilot turns toward an incoming fighter, the geometry becomes impossible. The attacker is closing at combined speeds of 500 miles per hour or more. The angle changes constantly. The target is no longer running in a straight line, but spiraling toward the shooter. A pilot has perhaps 2 seconds to adjust his aim, fire, and pull away before collision becomes inevitable. Most pilots cannot make that shot. Vejtasa yanked his stick hard left and pulled back, bringing his Dauntless around in a tight climbing turn directly into the lead Zero's path. The Japanese pilot had expected an easy tail chase. Instead, he found himself staring at the nose of an American dive bomber, growing larger in his windscreen at a closure rate that left no time for correction. The Zero broke off, pulling up and away to avoid collision. Vejtasa had survived the first pass. 7 more fighters were circling for position. The next 60 seconds became a blur of violent maneuvering. Vejtasa repeated his tactic again and again. Each time a Zero dove on him, he turned into the attack. Each time, the Japanese pilot had to choose between collision and breaking away. Each time, the geometry bought Vejtasa another few seconds of life. His rear gunner was firing continuously. The twin 30-caliber machine guns swept across the sky, forcing attacking Zeros to break off or risk taking hits from an unexpected angle. The 2-man crew was fighting as a unit, pilot and gunner covering each other's blind spots. Around them, the other SBDs were dying. The problem with Vejtasa's tactic was that it only worked for one aircraft at a time. While he turned into one attacker, another Zero could line up a clean shot from a different angle. The Japanese pilots were experienced. They had fought over China. They knew how to coordinate attacks against a single target. Within the first 5 minutes, 4 of the 8 Dauntlesses went down. Pilots and gunners who had been flying formation with Vejtasa moments earlier were now falling toward the Coral Sea in burning wreckage. Some managed to bail out. Others did not. Vejtasa kept fighting. The Zero's weakness became apparent as the battle continued. The Japanese fighter was fast and agile, but its 20mm cannons carried only 60 rounds per gun. Its 7.7mm machine guns were light, designed to damage fabric-covered biplanes, not the all-metal construction of American aircraft. The SBD Dauntless had armor plating behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. It could absorb hits that would have destroyed a Zero, and Vejtasa was getting shots. Each time he turned into an attack, his nose briefly aligned with the incoming Zero. Each time, he squeezed the trigger on his twin 50-caliber guns. The bursts were short, measured in fractions of a second, but the 50-caliber round was devastating. 1 hit to a fuel tank, 1 hit to an engine, 1 hit to a pilot. Any of these could end the fight instantly. His first confirmed kill came when a Zero committed too deeply to a head-on pass. The Japanese pilot held his course a moment too long, trying to score hits on the American bomber. Vejtasa's 50 calibers found him first. The Zero's engine exploded in a spray of oil and coolant. The fighter rolled inverted and fell. The second Zero died in a similar manner. Another head-on pass. Another pilot who believed his speed advantage would allow him to fire and break away before the slow American bomber could respond. Another miscalculation. The third kill was different. Vejtasa and a Zero found themselves on a direct collision course. Neither pilot would give way. The closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour. At the last possible moment, both aircraft banked slightly to avoid destruction. They passed within feet of each other. Some accounts suggest Vejtasa's wingtip actually struck the Zero's wing, shearing it off. The Japanese fighter spiraled into the sea. 3 kills in a dive bomber against the most feared fighter aircraft in the Pacific. But the battle was not over. The Japanese strike force was still inbound. Torpedo planes were lining up their attack runs on Yorktown and Lexington, and half of the SBD anti-torpedo patrol had been destroyed. Vejtasa turned his battered Dauntless toward the fleet. His aircraft had taken hits. His ammunition was running low, but the torpedo planes were still coming, flying low and fast toward the American carriers. He pushed his throttle forward and dove toward them. The Japanese torpedo planes were Nakajima B-5N Type 97 aircraft. American pilots called them Kates. They were faster than the Dauntless, capable of 235 miles per hour in level flight. They carried the Type 91 aerial torpedo, a weapon that had already sunk or damaged dozens of Allied warships since December 7th. 14 Kates were making their approach on USS Lexington. 4 more targeted Yorktown. They flew at wave-top height, skimming the surface of the Coral Sea at barely 50 feet. At this altitude, anti-aircraft guns had difficulty tracking them. The torpedoes needed calm water and a straight approach to arm properly. Vejtasa dove toward them from above. The anti-torpedo patrol had been designed for exactly this moment. SBDs carried enough firepower to damage or destroy a torpedo plane before it could release its weapon. The dive bomber's speed disadvantage disappeared when attacking from altitude. Gravity provided acceleration that engines could not match. But the Kates were too fast. The Yorktown action report later noted that the SBDs attempted to intercept the enemy torpedo planes, but they were too fast for them. The torpedo bombers were already in their final approach when the dive bombers reached attack position. Vejtasa fired at the Kates as they streaked toward the carriers. His 50 calibers raked across one aircraft. He saw pieces fly off the fuselage, but the Kate kept flying. The Japanese pilots had committed to their attack runs. They would release their torpedoes or die trying. Most of them did both. At 11:20 a.m., 2 torpedoes struck USS Lexington on her port side. The massive carrier shuddered from the impacts. Flooding began immediately in her boiler rooms, but Lady Lex stayed afloat. Her damage control teams were among the best in the Navy. They contained the flooding and restored power to her engines within 30 minutes. USS Yorktown fared better. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, maneuvered the carrier through a forest of torpedo wakes. Japanese pilots released 11 torpedoes at Yorktown. Every single one missed. But the dive bombers found her. While Vejtasa and the surviving SBDs engaged the low-flying torpedo planes, 33 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down from 18,000 feet. Yorktown's combat air patrol was still out of position. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts. 7 Vals fell before reaching their release points. 26 continued their dives. At 11:27 a.m., a 500-pound bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck. The explosion penetrated 3 decks before detonating in an uptake compartment. Fires erupted throughout the ship's interior. 66 men died in the blast. Another sailor would die later from wounds. Vejtasa was still airborne when the bomb hit. His Dauntless had taken significant damage during the Zero engagement. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage and wings. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. The aircraft was handling sluggishly, likely from damage to control surfaces, but the engine still ran. The aircraft still flew. He nursed the SBD back toward Yorktown. The scene below him was chaos. Lexington was burning, black smoke pouring from her stack. Yorktown was also smoking, but her fires appeared smaller. Destroyers and cruisers circled the carriers, their guns still firing at retreating Japanese aircraft. Vejtasa landed on Yorktown at approximately noon. Ground crews counted the damage to his aircraft. Dozens of holes, shattered glass, damaged control cables. It was remarkable that the Dauntless had remained airworthy. The battle results became clear over the following hours. The American strike on Shokaku had inflicted serious damage. 3 bomb hits had wrecked her flight deck. She would spend months in repair at Kure Naval Arsenal. Her aircraft had diverted to Zuikaku, but both carriers were withdrawing northward. The American losses were worse. USS Lexington appeared to have survived her torpedo hits, but at 12:47 p.m., internal explosions began rocking the ship. Gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines had accumulated in her lower compartments. Sparks from damaged electrical systems ignited them. The explosions continued throughout the afternoon. At 5 p.m., Captain Frederick Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. Destroyers moved alongside to rescue her crew. By 7:32 p.m., Lexington slipped beneath the waves of the Coral Sea. 216 men died with her. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. Both sides had lost a carrier. Both sides claimed victory. In Tokyo, newspapers celebrated the destruction of American naval power. In Washington, admirals studied the results and found reasons for cautious optimism. In the ready room of USS Yorktown, Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vejtasa sat with the other surviving pilots of Scouting Squadron 5. 4 of the 8 SBDs that launched on anti-torpedo patrol had not returned. Half the patrol was gone. But Vejtasa had shot down 3 Zeros in a dive bomber. Word spread through the air group. A pilot from the Scouting Squadron had outfought Japanese fighters in an aircraft that was supposed to be a sitting duck. He had used tactics that no manual had described. He had survived an engagement that should have killed him. Within days, orders arrived. Vejtasa was being transferred to fighters. The Navy needed fighter pilots. Desperately. In the 5 months since Pearl Harbor, American carrier aviation had suffered devastating losses. The attack on December 7th had destroyed or damaged dozens of aircraft on the ground. The carrier Saratoga had been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January, spending months in repair. Lexington was now at the bottom of the Coral Sea. Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a bomb-damaged flight deck. Only 3 fleet carriers remained operational in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown, undergoing emergency repairs that would take 72 hours instead of the estimated 90 days. The Battle of Midway was approaching. The Navy could not afford to waste pilots who had proven themselves in combat. Vejtasa received his transfer orders in late May 1942. He was assigned to Fighting Squadron 10, a newly formed unit based at Naval Air Station San Diego. The squadron was flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats, the same stubby fighters that had struggled against Zeros throughout the Pacific. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander James Henry Flatley, Jr. Flatley was already a legend in naval aviation. He had fought at Coral Sea as executive officer of Fighting Squadron 42 aboard Lexington. He had engaged Zeros in combat and survived. More importantly, he had studied the Japanese fighter and developed tactics that gave Wildcat pilots a chance. The conventional wisdom in May 1942 held that the Zero was simply superior, faster, more maneuverable, better climbing. American pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros died. The standard advice was to avoid engagement entirely. Flatley rejected this thinking. He understood that the Zero had weaknesses that American pilots could exploit. The Japanese fighter lacked armor protection. A single burst from a Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns could destroy it. The Zero's lightweight construction made it fragile in high-speed dives. Above 350 miles per hour, its controls stiffened. Its ailerons became sluggish. A Wildcat diving at full throttle could escape a Zero that could not follow. Flatley developed training programs that emphasized these advantages. His pilots practiced diving attacks. They learned to fight in pairs, each wingman covering the other's blind spots. They studied energy management, trading altitude for speed and speed for position. He called his squadron the Grim Reapers. Vejtasa arrived at San Diego in June 1942. His reputation preceded him. The pilot who had shot down 3 Zeros in a dive bomber, the man who turned into attacks instead of running. Flatley recognized talent when he saw it, but Vejtasa was not content to simply adopt Flatley's tactics. He challenged them. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had developed a famous defensive maneuver called the beam defense, later known as the Thatch Weave. 2 aircraft flew parallel courses. When a Zero attacked one, it turned toward its partner. The partner turned toward the attacker. The Zero found itself caught between two wildcats, each with guns pointed at its flanks. Vejtasa studied the thatch weave and found it insufficient. The maneuver was defensive. It kept pilots alive, but did not destroy the enemy. He argued for more aggressive tactics, diving attacks from altitude, slashing runs through enemy formations, hit hard, break away, climb back to altitude, attack again. Flatly listened. He incorporated Vejtasa's ideas into squadron training. The Grim Reapers became one of the most aggressive fighter units in the Pacific Fleet. By September 1942, Fighting Squadron 10 was ready for combat. The strategic situation in the Pacific had changed dramatically since Coral Sea. The Battle of Midway in June had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost its best pilots, its most experienced deck crews, its irreplaceable aircraft. American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in August, seizing Henderson Field and establishing a foothold in the Solomon Islands. But the Japanese were not finished. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assembled a massive fleet to retake Guadalcanal: 4 carriers, 4 battleships, 14 cruisers, 44 destroyers. Thousands of Japanese soldiers prepared to land and overwhelm the Marines defending Henderson Field. The American response was desperate improvisation. Enterprise had returned from repairs. Hornet was operational. The new battleship South Dakota provided anti-aircraft protection. Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid commanded Task Force 61 with orders to stop the Japanese advance. Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, embarked aboard Enterprise in early October. Vejtasa was now a full lieutenant. He served as operations officer for the squadron, third in command behind Flatley and the executive officer. He had transitioned completely from dive bombers to fighters. His days of flying the slow, heavy Dauntless were over. On October 25, 1942, a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese carrier force 360 miles northwest of the Santa Cruz Islands. 4 carriers, dozens of escorts, hundreds of aircraft. The enemy was coming. That evening, Admiral William Halsey sent a message to Task Force 61. 2 words that would define the next 24 hours. Attack. Repeat. Attack. Vejtasa sat in the ready room of Enterprise, studying reconnaissance photographs of Japanese carriers. Shokaku and Zuikaku were there, the same ships he had fought at Coral Sea. They had been hunting each other for 6 months. Tomorrow, one of them would die. The day before the battle nearly ended in disaster. On October 25th, a PBY Catalina reported the Japanese carrier force 355 miles northwest of Task Force 61. Admiral Kinkaid faced a decision. The enemy was at the extreme edge of carrier aircraft range. A strike launched immediately might catch the Japanese before they could launch their own aircraft, but the returning pilots would have to land in darkness, a dangerous proposition on a pitching carrier deck. Kinkaid ordered the strike. Hornet's air group was designated the primary attack force. Enterprise would serve as duty carrier, keeping her fighters aboard to protect the task force. It was standard doctrine. 1 carrier attacks, 1 carrier defends. Then Kinkaid changed his mind. At 2:25 p.m., he ordered Enterprise to launch 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers on a search mission to locate the exact position of the Japanese fleet. 30 minutes later, he ordered the rest of Enterprise's air group to follow. Fighters, torpedo planes, everything. Vejtasa was incredulous. The search vectors assigned to the Enterprise pilots pointed away from the last known Japanese position. They were flying into empty ocean. Worse, the launch time meant they would be returning after sunset. Finding a carrier at night, in radio silence, with fuel running low, was nearly impossible. The pilots of Fighting Squadron 10 protested through the chain of command. The orders made no tactical sense. Enterprise was stripping herself of aircraft while the Japanese fleet was within striking distance. If enemy scouts found the American carriers, there would be no fighters to defend them. The order stood. Vejtasa launched with the rest of the Grim Reapers at approximately 3 p.m. They flew their assigned search vectors for hours, finding nothing but empty sea and scattered clouds. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, fuel gauges began showing the ugly truth. Some aircraft would not have enough to reach the designated recovery point. At dusk, the Enterprise Air Group turned back toward Point Option. the calculated position where their carrier should be waiting. Enterprise was not there. Kincaid had maneuvered the task force throughout the afternoon, responding to submarine contacts and course changes. The carrier was now miles from where her pilots expected to find her. Radio silence prevented communication. The air group was scattered across hundreds of square miles of darkening ocean, searching for a ship that had moved. Pilots began running out of fuel. Some ditched in the open water, hoping destroyers would find them before sharks did. Others circled desperately, watching their gauges drop toward empty. Vejtasa remembered something from the morning combat air patrol. Enterprise had been leaking oil. A thin slick trailed behind the carrier, visible on the surface of the sea. In the fading light, he dropped low and began searching for that slick. He found it. Following the oil trail through the darkness, Vejtasa located Enterprise and led other aircraft back to the carrier. Deck crews worked frantically, recovering aircraft in conditions that would have been considered too dangerous for daylight operations. Some pilots crashed on landing. Others ran out of fuel in the landing pattern and ditched alongside the ship. By midnight, the air group had been recovered. Barely. Vejtasa had saved aircraft and pilots through quick thinking and observation, but the experience left him shaken. Admiral Kincaid's orders had nearly destroyed Enterprise's air group before the battle even began. If the Japanese attacked at dawn, the American pilots would be exhausted, their aircraft damaged, their confidence rattled. The Japanese did attack at dawn. At 6:45 a.m. on October 26th, both sides launched search aircraft. At 7:40, a Japanese scout reported the American carriers. At 7:50, Enterprise radar detected incoming aircraft. Minutes later, American scouts found the Japanese fleet. Both sides launched full strikes simultaneously. The mathematics of carrier warfare meant that both fleets would be attacking each other at the same time. Japanese aircraft would arrive over the American carriers, while American aircraft were over the Japanese carriers. Defense would depend entirely on combat air patrol fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Fighting Squadron 10 had 8 Wildcats airborne on combat air patrol. Vejtasa was among them. At 8:22 a.m., radar operators on Enterprise reported a massive formation approaching from the northwest. Over 60 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. The entire striking power of the Japanese carrier fleet was inbound. Vejtasa checked his ammunition. Full load. He checked his fuel. Enough for 40 minutes of combat. He scanned the horizon to the northwest. The sky was filling with enemy aircraft. The first wave struck USS Hornet. 27 aircraft from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku descended on the American task force at 8:50 a.m. 15 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 12 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo planes. A screen of Zero fighters flew top cover. Vejtasa was part of the combat air patrol assigned to protect both carriers, but fighter direction was chaotic. Radio channels were clogged with overlapping transmissions. Radar operators struggled to track multiple formations approaching from different altitudes and directions. The 8 Wildcats of Fighting Squadron 10 were scattered across the sky, each pilot fighting his own desperate battle. Vejtasa spotted 2 Vals beginning their dive on Hornet from 18,000 feet. He pushed his throttle forward and climbed toward them. The Wildcats' Pratt & Whitney engines strained at full power, clawing for altitude. The Vals were already committed to their dives, screaming downward at nearly 300 miles per hour, their fixed landing gear creating the distinctive whistling sound that gave them their reputation. Vejtasa intercepted them at 12,000 feet. His first burst caught the lead Val in the engine cowling. The Japanese dive bomber staggered, trailing smoke. The pilot tried to continue his attack run, but the aircraft was dying. It rolled slowly to the left and fell away, splashing into the ocean without releasing its bomb. The second Val was already past him, diving toward Hornet. Vejtasa rolled inverted and pulled through, reversing his direction to pursue, but the angle was wrong. The Japanese pilot was too far ahead, too committed to his dive. Vejtasa fired a long burst at extreme range. He saw hits spark along the fuselage. The Val continued downward. At 8:54 a.m., a 250-kilogram bomb struck Hornet's flight deck near the island structure. The explosion killed 7 men instantly. Fires erupted across the deck. Seconds later, a burning valve, possibly the one Vejtasa had damaged, crashed directly into the carrier stack. Aviation gasoline sprayed across the signal bridge. More fires. 2 torpedoes struck Hornet's starboard side within the next 3 minutes. The carrier lost power. Dead in the water, she became a stationary target. More bombs found her. By 9:15 a.m., Hornet was burning from bow to stern. Vejtasa had no time to watch. Enterprise was next. The second wave appeared on radar at 9:30 a.m. This formation was larger, 44 aircraft, and leading the attack were 20 Kate torpedo bombers flying low and fast toward the surviving American carrier. Enterprise was the last operational fleet carrier in the Pacific. If she sank, the Guadalcanal campaign would collapse. Henderson Field would fall. The strategic initiative would shift entirely to Japan. Everything depended on stopping those torpedo planes. Vejtasa dove toward them. The Kates were approaching from multiple directions, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the carrier's ability to maneuver. Turn to avoid torpedoes from one group, and you present a perfect target to another. The only defense was to destroy the attackers before they could release their weapons. Vejtasa selected a group of 11 Kates boring in from the port side of Enterprise. He came at them from above and behind, using altitude to build speed. His 650 caliber machine guns opened fire at 400 yards. The first Kate exploded. The formation scattered. Japanese pilots broke in different directions, trying to escape the American fighter that had appeared among them. 3 Kates jettisoned their torpedoes immediately, the weapons tumbling uselessly into the sea. The carefully planned attack was disintegrating. Vejtasa stayed with them. He shot down a second Kate, then a third. His Wildcat was taking hits from Japanese rear gunners, but the bullets could not stop him. A fourth Kate fell, then a fifth. 5 torpedo bombers destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. Combined with his 2 Val kills earlier in the battle, Vejtasa had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. No American pilot had ever achieved such a score in one engagement. Not at Pearl Harbor, not at Midway, not at Coral Sea. Enterprise survived. Barely. 2 bombs struck the carrier during the battle. 3 near misses caused additional damage, but the torpedo attack had been broken. The coordinated assault that should have sunk her had fallen apart under Vejtasa's guns. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley watched the engagement from his own cockpit. He understood immediately what had happened. His pilot had saved the carrier. His pilot had possibly saved the entire Guadalcanal campaign. That evening, Flatley wrote in Vejtasa's flight log, 7 words that would follow the pilot for the rest of his life. Greatest single combat fight record in history. Then Flatley did something unusual for a squadron commander who rarely recommended medals. He began drafting a nomination for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor nomination traveled up the chain of command. Flatley documented everything: the 7 confirmed kills, the broken torpedo attack, the survival of Enterprise. He compared Vejtasa's achievement to Lieutenant Edward O'Hare's famous engagement in February, when O'Hare had shot down 5 Japanese bombers attacking USS Lexington. O'Hare received the Medal of Honor for that action. Vejtasa had shot down 7 aircraft, 2 more than O'Hare, in circumstances equally desperate. The nomination reached Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commander of Task Force 61. Kincaid had problems. The Battle of Santa Cruz was technically an American defeat. Hornet was gone, sunk by Japanese destroyers after her own escorts failed to scuttle her. Enterprise had survived, but was badly damaged. Her forward elevator jammed in the up position, her flight deck scarred by bomb hits. The American carrier force in the Pacific had been reduced to a single operational ship. Questions were being asked about Kincaid's decisions. The disastrous search mission on October 25th that nearly destroyed Enterprise's air group before the battle. The positioning of combat air patrol that allowed Japanese strikes to reach the carriers with minimal interception. The failure to coordinate fighter direction effectively. Kincaid needed the narrative of Santa Cruz to focus on Japanese losses, not American mistakes. A Medal of Honor would draw attention. Reporters would investigate. Questions would be asked about why such heroism was necessary. Why were 8 Wildcats defending 2 carriers against 60 aircraft? Why was fighter direction so chaotic? Why had the air group been scattered across empty ocean the night before the battle? Kincaid downgraded the nomination. Instead of the Medal of Honor, Vejtasa received his third Navy Cross. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and indomitable fighting spirit. It acknowledged the 7 aircraft destroyed. It made no mention of the Medal of Honor recommendation that Flatley had submitted. The decision stunned the pilots of Fighting Squadron 10. Hal Buell, a dive bomber pilot who had flown with Vejtasa at Coral Sea, later wrote that Vejtasa deserved the Medal of Honor for his flying at Coral Sea alone, let alone what he accomplished at Santa Cruz. Other pilots agreed. The downgrade became a source of quiet bitterness within the air group. Vejtasa said nothing publicly. He accepted the Navy Cross and continued flying. The strategic impact of Santa Cruz became clear in the following weeks. The Japanese had won a tactical victory. They sank Hornet and damaged Enterprise, but they lost 99 aircraft and dozens of irreplaceable pilots. The veteran aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had sunk Prince of Wales and Repulse, who had devastated Allied air power across the Pacific, were dying faster than Japan could train replacements. Enterprise returned to service within weeks. Her repair crews worked around the clock at Noumea, patching bomb damage and restoring her flight deck. By mid-November, she was operational again, the only American carrier defending Guadalcanal during the crucial naval battles that decided the campaign. The Japanese carriers never recovered from Santa Cruz. Shokaku and Zuikaku had lost so many aircraft and pilots that they could not mount offensive operations for months. The light carriers Junyo and Hyo lacked the trained air crews to fill the gap. When American forces pushed up the Solomon Islands chain in 1943, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of its former strength. Vejtasa's combat tour ended in early 1943. He was transferred stateside to train new fighter pilots at Naval Air Station Atlantic City. The skills he had learned, the tactics he had developed, the instincts that had kept him alive through 2 carrier battles were now being passed to the next generation of naval aviators. His final combat score stood at 10 1/4 confirmed aerial victories, 3 zeros at Coral Sea, 7 aircraft at Santa Cruz, a shared kill from earlier in the war. By the standards of the Pacific Air War, he was an ace twice over. He never flew in combat again. The war continued without him. New carriers joined the fleet: Essex, Yorktown, Lexington. Names resurrected from ships that had been sunk. New fighters arrived: the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair. Aircraft designed with the lessons of 1942 built into their airframes. Vejtasa watched from training squadrons as pilots he had instructed flew these new aircraft into battle. The desperate days of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz faded into memory. The Navy was winning now. The question was no longer survival, but victory. But for Stanley Vejtasa, there was still one more chapter to write. A career that would span 3 decades, commands that would take him from training squadrons to aircraft carriers, and a question that would follow him for the rest of his life. Why had the Navy denied him the Medal of Honor? Stanley Vejtasa stayed in the Navy. The war ended in August 1945, but Vejtasa's career was just beginning. He commanded fighter squadrons. He served as air officer aboard USS Essex during the Korean War, coordinating strikes against North Korean and Chinese positions. He attended the Naval War College. He rose steadily through the ranks. In November 1962, Captain Stanley Vejtasa assumed command of USS Constellation. The irony was not lost on him. 20 years earlier, he had been a junior lieutenant fighting desperately to save Enterprise from Japanese torpedo planes. Now he commanded one of the most powerful warships ever built. Constellation was a supercarrier, over 1,000 feet long, carrying 80 aircraft, capable of projecting American power anywhere in the world. Vejtasa commanded Constellation for 1 year. He ran the ship with the same precision and aggression that had defined his flying. Officers who served under him remembered a captain who demanded excellence and led by example. The lessons of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz had shaped him. He understood that preparation and training were the difference between victory and disaster. He retired from the Navy on July 1, 1970, with the rank of captain. 32 years of service, 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, the Legion of Merit, countless other decorations, but not the Medal of Honor. The question resurfaced periodically throughout Vejtasa's retirement. In 1987, He was inducted into the Carrier Aviation Hall of Fame, recognition of his place among the greatest naval aviators in American history. Journalists who interviewed him inevitably asked about Santa Cruz, about the 7 kills, about the medal that never came. Vejtasa deflected the questions. He spoke about his fellow pilots, about the men who did not come back, about Jimmy Flatley, who had believed in him and trained him and recommended him for the highest honor the nation could bestow. Flatley had died in 1958, a vice admiral, never knowing that his Medal of Honor recommendation had been quietly buried. In 2012, author Ted Edwards began researching Vejtasa's life for a biography. He interviewed the aging pilot extensively, recording hours of conversation about Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and the decades that followed. Edwards documented the Medal of Honor controversy in detail, tracing the paperwork through naval archives. The evidence was clear. Flatley had submitted the recommendation. Kincaid had downgraded it. The decision had been made for reasons that had nothing to do with Vejtasa's performance in combat. Edwards titled his book, 7 at Santa Cruz. Stanley Winfield. Vejtasa died on January 23, 2013. He was 98 years old. In accordance with his wishes, he was cremated and his ashes were scattered at sea. The ocean that had witnessed his greatest triumphs received him one final time. The Medal of Honor question remains unresolved. Some military historians have argued that the award could still be granted posthumously. Congress has the authority to waive time limitations for Medal of Honor nominations. Presidents have occasionally approved such waivers for World War II veterans whose heroism was overlooked or suppressed. But Stanley Vejtasa never asked for reconsideration. He never lobbied for the medal. He never complained publicly about Kincaid's decision. He simply lived his life, served his country, and let his record speak for itself. That record speaks loudly. 3 Zeros shot down in a dive bomber, 7 aircraft destroyed in a single mission, a carrier saved from destruction, a campaign preserved. All accomplished by a pilot who was told his aircraft could not fight, who faced odds that should have killed him, who refused to accept the limitations that others imposed. The SBD Dauntless that Vejtasa flew at Coral Sea was never designed for dogfighting. The Navy sent him against Zeros in an aircraft 60 miles per hour slower, with half the maneuverability, expecting him to die. He turned into the attacks instead. The lesson of Stanley Vejtasa is simple. The weapon matters less than the warrior. The aircraft matters less than the pilot. Courage and skill can overcome any disadvantage if the person wielding them refuses to quit. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about dive bomber pilots who fought Zeros with impossible odds. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Stanley Swede Vejtasa does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.